Welcome to Queen of the North, a Game of Thrones spin-off story written by Brian M. Brumbaugh, narrated by Gwyneth Paltrow. When the wars ended and the dragons fell silent, one Stark stood alone beneath the snow, not as a survivor, but as a queen. This is the story of Sansa Stark, her return, her reign, her rise as the most beloved ruler the North has ever known. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Red Wolf Returns. The cold came first. Not the harsh cold of Winterfell's dead of night midwinters, but something more intimate, the northern air she hadn't breathed in since before war and fire had taken everything. Sansa Stark closed her eyes and let it fill her lungs. Behind her, the carriage wheels groaned as they crossed the white-capped ridges of Moat Cailin. Before her, the path home. Snowflakes drifted down like slow, silent omens. At her side rode Jon Snow, his black cloak billowing behind him like the shadow of a ghost long buried. He hadn't spoken much since they left King's Landing, but he didn't need to. Between them was a comfort born of shared silence. Two wolves too weary to howl. Sansa had changed. She still wore the Stark sigil on her chest, stitched in gray thread over deep blue velvet, but her posture no longer bent with the weight of survival. She held herself straight, like a queen even before the crown. Her eyes were older now, so much older. Jon glanced sideways. "You sure about this?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on the distant hills that whispered of home. "Yes," she said finally. "The North is mine now, not by conquest, not by birth alone, but by choice, theirs and mine." He nodded, saying nothing more. His eyes looked beyond her, to some place no one else could follow. They reached Winterfell as the sun began to set, bleeding amber light across the sky like a dying fire. The walls were half rebuilt, the gates freshly ironed. Stark banners flew again from the ramparts, and below them, the people of the North waited. Men in thick fur cloaks and women in layers of wool stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces ruddy from the wind. Old men with frostbitten ears, young girls with plaited hair and wooden swords on their backs, small folk, soldiers, lords and daughters of lords. They had all come, not just to see her, but to claim her. The gates opened. Sansa rode through slowly, regal atop a white horse, her red hair catching the dying light like wildfire. The people did not cheer. They bowed, every head, every back bent as one. Jon dismounted and walked beside her the final stretch. His boots crunched the snow in rhythm with hers. Maester Torlin stood atop the great steps of Winterfell, holding an ancient tome bound in cracked leather. Beside him, Brienne of Tarth stood tall and gleaming steel, her hand on her sword but her eyes warm with pride. Arya's absence was a pang Sansa could not quiet, but she'd left a letter, carried by a raven that arrived just 2 days earlier. A single line, scrawled in Arya's rough script. "I wouldn't dare be there. You're finally becoming what they feared you would." Sansa smiled at the memory. She stepped forward. They gathered in the Godswood that night. The moon hung fat and pale above the weirwood tree, its red leaves whispering like old tongues. The lords and ladies of the North, Glover, Manderly, Serwyn, Umber, Talhart, stood in a wide circle around her. The maester raised the book. "In the name of the old gods, the new, and the North itself, who do you name your queen?" Lord Manderly spoke first. "Sansa Stark, Queen of the North." One by one, each voice followed, rolling like thunder through the snow-laced air. "Queen of the North, Queen of the North, Queen of the North." Jon stood off to the side, arms crossed, face unreadable. Brienne placed the circlet on her head, simple silver, shaped like the curling claws of a direwolf. The wind picked up, swirling around Sansa's cloak, catching the hem of her gown like a whisper of approval from the gods themselves. When the final voice had spoken, Sansa stepped forward. "I will not be your ruler from a throne of fear," she said, her voice steady as winter itself. "I will be your voice, your sword, your memory. We will never bend again. The North remembers." The wind howled then, not in protest, but in salute. And Sansa Stark, last daughter of Eddard and Catelyn, became queen not just of Winterfell, but of every heart that beat beneath northern snow. That night she stood on the ramparts alone, overlooking her reborn kingdom. Jon found her there. "You'll be good for them," he said quietly. "I'll be better than that," she replied. I'll be theirs." He looked at her, something old and raw in his eyes. "I should leave in the morning." Sansa didn't argue. "You'll always have a place here," she said. "I never did before," he answered, and then, after a long pause, "but maybe now, I will." They stood a while longer, watching snowflakes drift through the night air like falling stars. Below, the wolves howled. Winter had come and gone. The North had endured, and Sansa Stark would lead it into something new. Not peace, not yet, but something just as rare. Hope. Chapter 2. The Shape of Snow. The crown was cold against her brow. Fitting, Sansa thought. All things northern should be. 3 days had passed since her coronation, and already the hallways of Winterfell buzzed not with celebration, but with purpose. The time for songs and toasts had passed. Now came the work. Queens, unlike princesses, did not simply survive court. They built it. Brienne stood beside the great table in the strategy chamber, arms crossed, watching with silent pride as Sansa reviewed the roll of lords summoned to her first official council. "You've grown into something more than your mother ever dreamed," Brienne said softly. "And something my father never expected," Sansa replied without looking up. "He thought honor could guide the world. I know better." They came one by one. Lord Clee Serwyn, his beard frosted and patched with gray, was the first to kneel. His lands had been raided during the wars, twice by Boltons, once by Lannister-aligned sellswords. He looked up at her like a man who had run out of prayers and found something better. Resolve. "I swore to your brother once," he said, "and now I swear again. To you, my queen." Serwyn holds for the north. Then came Lady Lyra Manderly, dressed in white silks trimmed with sea green, her youth belying a sharp mind inherited from her late Uncle Wyman. She offered not just fealty, but a trade compact, grain from White Harbor in exchange for timber from the Wolf's Wood, and free passage to inland markets. "The North will not merely survive," she said. "It will thrive. And I would rather starve than trade with King's Landing again." Sansa only nodded. She liked Lyra. Her confidence didn't come from men, it came from clarity. By mid-morning the hall was full. The Umbers of Last Hearth, the Glovers of Deepwood Motte, the Tall Hearts of Torrhen Square, all had bled in the wars. All had buried fathers, sons, and brothers. But now they stood tall, loyal, not to a banner or a throne, but to Winterfell reborn. Sansa rose, her voice as measured and calm as the snow tapping against the high glass windows. "The North has no king. No queen above me. We are free, but freedom is not a gift. It is a burden. We carry it together, or not at all. Each of your houses must now serve more than themselves. Each of you will lead the restoration of this realm, not for glory, but because no one else will." There was silence, a grave kind. Then Lord Glover stepped forward, one hand across his chest. "You speak like a Stark," he said. "I am a Stark," Sansa answered, "but I lead like a Northerner." Later that day, in the solar, the fire crackled low as Sansa met privately with Lord Brandon Talhart. He was taller than she remembered. His presence filled the chamber before his words did. 6'6", broad-shouldered, built like a tower, but with eyes that studied, not stared. Unlike the lords who postured, Brandon waited to be heard. "You summoned me, Your Grace?" he asked. Sansa poured him a cup of mead, gestured to the chair across from her. "I've read the reports. Torrhen Square was spared the worst of the war. Your forests are still thick, your quarries deep." "They are," he replied, "but our workers are few. The war took many." "So offer pay to the free folk," she said. "Jon has opened the gates. They want homes. You want hands." Brandon considered it, then gave a slow nod. "Stone and timber for the whole of the North. I'll build it if you let me lead it." Sansa met his gaze. "And will you follow as well as you lead?" "I will," he said. "If it's you I'm following." The words hung there, honest, unpolished, dangerous. Sansa looked down at her hands. "This is not the time for courtship," she said softly. "Then I will wait," he said, "until it is." By week's end, a great plan had begun to take shape, and the Serwyns would handle the supply lines eastward, and the Manderlys would revitalize port trade. Umbers would oversee recruitment for the Queen's Guard, and the Glovers would reopen iron mines in the western ridges, and the Tallhearts would lead the processing and shipment of stone and timber for the rebuilding of keeps across the north. A realm fractured by war now spun slowly back into orbit around its queen. In the quiet of her chambers, Sansa looked out over the courtyard as scaffolds rose along Winterfell's walls, and blacksmiths struck sparks into the morning air. Jon had sent a raven that morning. "Castle Black is not dead yet. I found 2 boys trying to raise chickens in the armory. Might let them," she smiled. That night, in the Godswood, she knelt before the heart tree and whispered not prayers but promises. "To you, Father, I swear the North will not fall again. Not to men like Littlefinger, not to beasts like Ramsay, not to silence, not to fear." The red leaves rustled above her, catching the moonlight like blood and snow. And far away, across 1,000 frozen branches, a wolf howled. Chapter 3. The Tall Heart Proposal. The first spring of Sansa's reign came cautiously. In the north, spring did not sing. It crept. Snow lingered where shadows fell, and only the hardiest green dared peek from the frost-bitten ground. But it was enough. Enough to thaw stone. Enough to build. Enough to court. The timber yard rose like a city of its own on the outskirts of Torrens Square. Branched scaffolds crisscrossed massive trees felled from the wolfswood, their bark stripped and bundled in piles ready for shipment. Beneath them, blacksmiths forged nails and saws, while engineers barked measurements across frozen mud. Sansa walked slowly through the site, her fur cloak trailing behind her. She was accompanied by Brienne and Maester Torlin, though neither spoke. Brandon Tallheart didn't yet know she was there. She watched him, towering, shirt rolled to his elbows, directing the work of 20 men with a voice that commanded without cruelty. When a pulley snapped and dropped a plank, he moved before anyone else, grabbing the nearest man by the collar and pulling him out of the way. Then he turned and began reinforcing the rig himself, hands black with pitch, jaw set like steel. "A lord who works like a builder," Maester Torlin muttered. Brienne smiled. "He'll fit in just fine." Sansa allowed herself a small smirk. "Only if he learns how to ask for leave before proposing marriage." Brienne choked on her breath. "He what?" "Not in words, but he doesn't need them, does he?" That evening, Brandon came to Winterfell. He'd cleaned himself up, mostly. His tunic was pressed, his boots scrubbed, his hair tied back in a thick tail, but there was still sawdust clinging to his shoulders. He didn't bow. He stood and waited. "You sent no raven," Sansa said, seated on the carved oak chair before the hearth. "You were watching," Brandon replied. "I figured I'd earned the courtesy of asking in person." Brienne remained in the room. Sansa didn't dismiss her. She liked having someone there who could kill him if necessary. Sansa folded her hands. "Ask then." He did not fumble. "I'd court you properly if you'd allow it. Not to gain power, not to wear a crown, but because I have seen queens, and I've seen you, and they're not the same thing." Sansa stared into the flames. "You'd take the name Stark? If it kept your family alive in name and in blood, yes. You'd serve as my equal?" "No," he said simply. "I'd serve as your shield." "I don't want to be your equal, Sansa. I want to be the man who makes your days easier and your enemies afraid." She looked up at him. For a long time, she said nothing. "Then, you have my permission to try." The courtship began in earnest. It wasn't a flurry of flowers and songs. It was practical, northern. Brandon walked beside her through lumber yards and mine shafts. They shared hard bread by firelight with common folk, reviewing tax ledgers and rebuilding plans. He spoke plainly and worked harder than anyone else on her council. He never called her Sansa in public. "Only your grace." But he looked at her like a man dying of thirst staring at rain. The realm approved. The Umbers called him a worthy match. The Manderleys offered sea stone from their personal reserves to help carve a new hall wing for the royal family. Even Lady Lyra Manderley, sharp as ever, whispered during a feast, "He doesn't just want your crown, he wants your mornings. That's rarer." Children began to carve crude dolls of Queen Sansa and the Big Wolf, selling them at market stalls beside meat pies and hand-forged trinkets. Brienne caught one and brought it to her. Sansa's figure looked regal. Brandon's wore a comically large beard and axe. "They have a sense of humor, at least," Sansa muttered. One moonlit evening, Sansa stood alone in the Godswood. She felt him before she heard him. "You've come to propose," she said quietly. Brandon halted. I've come to ask, he corrected. Sansa turned. I spoke with Brienne, with Maester Torlin, even with Jon. He said you look like you could wrestle a mammoth and write poetry about it. Brandon's lip twitched. I have written poetry. Terrible, but I tried. I've spoken with the people, she continued, and they adore you. You've rebuilt 12 keeps already, opened 3 new trade roads, and you've done it without boasting once. That's rare. Especially for a man who could crush melons with his biceps. So is your answer yes? She didn't smile. She stepped forward, so close she had to look up to meet his eyes. It's yes, she said, but make no mistake, I am not a prize. I am the North, and you will guard it with your life. Brandon nodded. With my last breath. Then he knelt in the snow, not with a ring, but with his sword laid at her feet, and for the first time in years Sansa Stark allowed herself to hope for happiness. Chapter 4. Keeps of Ice and Stone. The snow melted slower in the hills. Even as the valleys thawed and the rivers swelled with cold water, winter still clung to the highlands and the ridges, as if unwilling to release its grip on a land that had earned its name. But Sansa Stark had no intention of waiting on weather. By decree of the crown, every great house that had sworn loyalty would be granted a newly restored keep, rebuilt in full at the crown's expense. Not just as reward, but as a symbol, a declaration. The North will not remember ruin. It will remember resilience. Serwyn, Glover, Manderley, Talhart, Umber, all were chosen. Even lesser bannermen were offered stone and timber for village fortification, and so began the largest construction effort the North had seen since the days of the Kings of Winter. At Torrhen Square, Lord Brandon Talhart directed work on his own ancestral keep last. He insisted on completing the others first. He had dozens of teams in the field, and stonecutters from the granite-rich cliffs above Long Lake, and carpenters from the Wolfswood, trained to season timber on site. Engineers, most trained at Old Town, now Northmen by oath. Sansa personally visited each site. She traveled with a small retinue, Brienne, a half-dozen guards, and her master builder Ronan Slate, a quiet man with eyes like cracked slate and a permanent scowl that made small folk think he hated them. He didn't. He just hated bad masonry. At Last Hearth, the keep had been little more than a burned-out husk. Now it stood 2 stories high, its new walls twice as thick and lined with deep channels for boiling oil. Lord Umber wept when he saw it. The man who once drank mead from a giant's skull broke down in tears beside his daughter. At White Harbor, Lady Lyra Manderley hosted a feast beneath her half-finished new hall. In the center, a table carved from driftwood was set with roast fish, lemon cakes, and seaweed wine. "You've not just given us wood and stone," she told Sansa. "You've given us pride. We wear it like cloaks." At Winterfell, the restoration was nearly complete. The new Hall of Records, Sansa's vision, was already being filled with scrolls, contracts, and genealogies. She insisted it sit not above the crypts, but beside them. "Let the living remember the dead," she'd said, "but let them not join them too soon." The old godswood remained untouched, but the walls surrounding it were lined with lanterns now, a place for reflection and light, not shadow. A council chamber was added beside the great hall, round in shape, with 12 carved seats for her most trusted lords. And at the top of the highest tower, Sansa had a small observatory built. No larger than a cloister, but entirely her own. Not for war, not for court, just silence. Brandon returned to Winterfell late one evening, his hands raw from overseeing the final stone placements at Deepwood Motte. Sansa met him in the library, where she had spread maps of the entire realm across the long table. He stood silently as she pointed to each completed site, then finally to the next one, Torrhen Square. "I've kept it for last," she said. "I noticed," he replied. She looked up. "I wanted you to build something, for yourself." Brandon leaned across the table. His hands brushed hers. "I've built for everyone else," he said. "All I want now is a home I can build with you." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Then ask me properly," Sansa said. He proposed the next morning, under a sky of pale blue with wind chimes singing in the courtyard. Not with kneeling, not with rings, but with a stone, polished, carved, a new cornerstone for the west wing of Winterfell, a family wing. Brienne, Maester Torlin, Lyra Manderley, Lord Serwyn, even Sir Davos were all gathered. Sansa stood before them, cloak drawn, face calm. He handed her the stone with both hands. "I offer you no empty words," Brandon said, "only the foundation I want to build with you, stone by stone, name by name, breath by breath." Sansa looked at him, then at the stone, and then she placed her hand over his and said simply, "Yes." The crowd didn't cheer, they wept, because they knew the Queen of the North hadn't just secured peace. She'd had found love that didn't demand a crown to be valid. That night, in the rebuilt hall of the Kingsguard, Sansa sat beside Brandon as plans for the royal wedding began to swirl through the chamber. She let the others talk, let them dream, because for the first time in years, so did she. Chapter 5. The Queen's Wedding. The snow had long since receded, and with it, the last chill of doubt. Now the banners of the great northern houses flew high above Winterfell's walls, not in defiance, but in celebration. The Queen was to wed, and the North would remember this day for 1,000 years. Sansa stood before the great mirror in her chambers, dressed not yet in her gown, but in her shift of soft grey wool lined with fox fur. Her hair was being braided by 2 girls from House Talhart, nieces of Brandon's who'd begged to be part of the preparations. "My mother would have liked this," Sansa murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Brienne stood by the hearth, cleaning her sword and not looking up. "Your mother would have been proud of you, and she would have broken the fingers of any man who crossed you." Sansa smiled. Yes, she would have. The guest list was not merely noble, it was legendary. In Jon Snow, having ridden down from Castle Black, arrived quietly and refused the dais, insisting on a seat among the Stark bannermen. King Bran the Broken, ruler of the 6 kingdoms, entered beneath a weirwood arched gate in a custom-built sled, guided by the children of the forest he had once visited beyond the wall. And Tyrion Lannister, his hair now graying, arrived with a flask in one hand and a self-deprecating toast already prepared. Then Samwell, Tarly, and Gilly, bearing gifts of old Valyrian tomes and northern healing scrolls. And Bronn of the Blackwater, technically Lord of Highgarden now, brought a bouquet of golden roses and a wink that earned him a warning glare from Brienne. And Brienne of Tarth, polished and regal in her formal armor, standing as Sansa's sworn protector and unofficial maid of honor. And from the far reaches of the world, other banners arrived. The White Falcon of House Arryn, the Trout of House Tully, flown by Edmure's son in his stead, and even the Kraken of House Greyjoy, carried by a lone ship captain who had once fought beside Theon at Moat Cailin. The day of the wedding dawned beneath skies so blue they felt painted. Winterfell had never looked more alive. The courtyards were swept, the stones scrubbed. Hundreds of torches lined the battlements. The great hall was open to the sky for the first time in decades, letting sun pour down on its old bones. Sansa wore a gown unlike anything the realm had seen, a blending of Tully red, stark gray, and Talhart green, woven into a cloak of flowing ice blue silk. Around her neck she wore a simple pendant, her mother's direwolf pin, newly restored. Brandon wore a formal northern tunic with fur shoulders, a leather belt, and steel bracers. But most important of all, he wore the Stark sigil across his chest, not Talhart. He had taken her name, and with it, her cause. The ceremony was held in the Godswood. 1,000 guests stood silent among the weirwood roots. The air was thick with memory. It was Jon who walked her down the aisle, not as a brother, but as a shield of the past. As they passed under the branches, he whispered, "I've never been good at words, but I'm proud of you, little bird." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for flying north." The weirwood's red leaves fluttered like falling blood. Before the carved face of the old god, Sansa and Brandon said no words of property, no oaths of possession, only a vow of protection, fidelity, and shared burden. "I will not bind you," Sansa said aloud. "I will walk with you, and I will not follow behind you," Brandon replied. "I will stand beside you." When the final vow was spoken, and the old gods gave no objection, Sansa and Brandon Stark kissed, and the people erupted in cheers that echoed across the hills. The wolves of the forest howled, the ravens took wing, and the snow, so long absent, fell once more light and fleeting, as if winter itself had paused to give its blessing. The feast was held in the rebuilt Great Hall. Jon drank too much. Tyrion drank more. Brienne gave a short speech and then arm-wrestled Bran to a draw. Sam told stories no one wanted to hear but everyone needed. King Bran offered no speech, but gifted Sansa a carved staff made of weirwood, engraved with every house sigil in the north. Even Arya had sent a raven from beyond the seas. Don't get soft, Sansa. I still expect you to outlive your enemies. Love hard, kill harder. A. As the torches dimmed and music slowed, Sansa stepped onto the balcony above the courtyard. Brandon stood behind her, silent. They love you, he said. They love the hope I give them, she corrected. But hope fades. Stone lasts. He took her hand. Then let's build something that outlives both. And in that moment, watching her realm below, her enemies buried and her people rising, Sansa Stark was not just Queen of the North. She was its mother, its voice, and its future. And Winterfell, for the first time in a generation, felt like home again. Chapter 6. The Wedding of Ice and Fire. Winterfell had not slept. The wedding day had passed in a whirlwind of joy, vows, and roaring fires, but the celebration had only just begun. For the North did not believe in swift pleasures. They believed in endurance. Love, like winter, must last. Now came the feast, the real feast. The great hall blazed with light. Dozens of long trestle tables stretched the length of the stone chamber, piled high with roast boar, honeyed carrots, wild goose in berry glaze, and fresh loaves steaming with butter. Casks of dark ale were cracked open by the score. Mead horns passed from hand to hand. Every hearth fire roared. At the center sat Sansa and Brandon, flanked by Jon Snow and Brienne of Tarth, with King Bran opposite them in a carved wooden sled, pulled to place by two direwolf banners. The mood was wild but reverent. Northern music pounded against the old stone, and laughter rose like steam. Sansa's gown had changed, dark blue velvet, stitched with silver thread in the pattern of a rising wolf. A woven circlet of ashwood and ice pearls adorned her head. Brandon wore stark black, with a silver direwolf pin over his chest. No sigil of tall heart remained. He had become a Stark. Tyrion stood atop a bench to deliver his toast. My lords and ladies, I once told your queen she'd survive us all, and as always, I was right. Laughter. But what none of you know is that she once looked me in the eye after being married off, beaten down, and betrayed, and she said, I'm not broken, just waiting. He raised his cup. Well, she's waited long enough. To Sansa Stark, Queen of the North, and now Queen of all our hearts. May her reign be long, her justice swift, and her husband extremely obedient. More laughter. Even Brienne cracked a smile. Brandon raised his tankard in reply. If she lets me live long enough, I'll be both. Outside, Winterfell shone like a beacon. Snow had returned just in time, light and glittering, brushing the rooftops like powdered silver. Fires crackled in every window. Sansa stole away only once during the night, slipping out to the godswood where the weirwood stood, silent and red. She knelt beneath its branches. Thank you, she whispered, not to a god, but to everyone who had ever hurt her, because they had forged her crown sharper than any blade. Behind her, Brandon stood quietly. Cold night for prayer, he said. Hot night for memory, she replied. They did not consummate the marriage in fanfare or frenzy. There was no silk-sheeted, perfumed chamber, no candles or flowers, just a room built of stone, warmed by a fire and layered in wolf pelts. Her room. Now theirs. Brandon didn't reach for her. He waited. Sansa removed the crown herself, removed her cloak, then stepped forward. She placed a hand to his chest over the direwolf pin and whispered, You don't own me. He nodded once. Never will. And only then did she kiss him. It was not lust. It was recognition of every scar, of every silence, of every road that had led to this one moment of peace. The next morning, the people of Winterfell woke to find the queen's banner flying beside her husband's newly raised sigil, a direwolf howling beside a broadleaf tree, the joining of House Stark and Tallheart. A new house, a new era, and a northern kingdom reborn not from fire or conquest, but from love, duty, and the iron will of a red-haired queen who had outlived them all. Chapter 7. Sons of the Snow. The first child was born during the longest night of the year, Sansa labored for hours in the old queen's chamber, the air thick with firelight and the scent of boiled cloth. Maester Torlin and 2 midwives moved with hushed efficiency. Brandon paced the stone corridor outside like a bear in a cage, silent, rigid. A man who would rather face a sword than hear his wife cry out again. And then, a cry. Not Sansa's, not pain, life, a boy. Red-faced, squirming, wailing like a wolf pup. When they placed him in Sansa's arms, her hands trembled. "He's got your eyes," she whispered to Brandon as he entered, breathless and broken with awe. "But that's my nose. Poor thing." They named him Eddard, after the man who had given them everything and asked for nothing. The kingdom rejoiced. Bonfires were lit from Deepwood Motte to White Harbor. Grain was gifted freely. The free folk beyond the wall sent carved toys made of bone and antler. A great iron bell, salvaged from an old sept near Torrens Square, was installed in the Winterfell courtyard and rung 12 times. Tyrion sent a letter that read simply, "A new Stark, God's help us all." 3 years later came the second boy. Born in early summer, he arrived screaming and wild-eyed, fists clenched, a force of nature from the moment he drew breath. Sansa held him close and laughed, sweat still dampening her brow. "His name," she told the midwife, "is Rickon." Brandon entered and looked between his sons. "Eddard watches. Rickon bites." Sansa smiled. "The realm will need both." The years that followed passed with a strange, wonderful rhythm. Eddard was thoughtful, precise, quiet. He listened before speaking, asked questions others missed, and memorized every page Maester Torlin gave him. He loved maps and dogs and silence. Rickon was fire. He threw apples at guards from the battlements, learned to ride a pony before he could walk properly, and once chased a bear cub into the kennels just to see what would happen. Together they were chaos and balance, a living reflection of the North's past and future. And their mother was everywhere. Sansa ruled not from the shadows of a war room, but from the heart of her people. She walked with them, ate with them, held their sick children, and listened to their gossip. She oversaw the repair of floodgates in Barrowton and commissioned new grain silos near the western lakes. She brought maesters north for training, founded the first northern school of healing, and introduced a council of village wives and grandmothers who advised her on food, crops, and common wisdom. She made widows captains. She made bastards stewards. She made the North believe in itself again. Brandon changed, too. He still led the timber and stone networks, but he spent more time at Winterfell. With Eddard, he practiced sword forms and taught restraint. With Rickon, he wrestled in the mud and lost on purpose. With Sansa, he was still, content to sit beside her as she read aloud from her father's journals. One evening, while snow fell and the boys slept, Sansa whispered to him, "You are more than I ever hoped for." Brandon kissed her temple. "And you," he said, "are exactly what I feared, a woman too strong to be contained." By the time Rickon turned 7, the entire North had changed, and White Harbor was now a bustling trade hub with ships arriving from Old Town and Braavos, and the wall had been restored in part not to keep people out, but to welcome travelers with dignity. And Winterfell had grown, a new wing for scholars, a new hall for the common folks' petitions, a nursery large enough for all noble children to learn together, regardless of name or rank. There was peace, not perfect, but earned. On Rickon's 7th birthday, Jon Snow arrived unannounced. Still commander of the Wall, gray now, scarred, but unmistakably Stark. He brought with him a blade carved from dragonglass and a handful of wildling children to be trained in the North's new ways. He watched Rickon race through the snow with Eddard and laughed. "You sure he's not a Baratheon?" Jon muttered. Sansa smiled. "He's a Stark, and I'll kill anyone who forgets it." That night, with the boys asleep and Jon drinking beside the fire, Sansa and Brandon stood at the top of the battlements. The night was clear. The North stretched out like a tapestry below, silent, strong, eternal. "He's got your mouth," Brandon said of Rickon. Sansa leaned against his shoulder. "He's got our future." Chapter 8. Shadows in the Snow. The first sign came in spring. The snowmelt came too early, flooding the eastern plains around Barrowton. Entire flocks were lost. The granaries along the Green Fork began to rot. A sickness followed, light at first, then persistent. fever, chills, coughs that rattled lungs until voices faded. Sansa rode east within a fortnight, wrapped in her travel cloak, accompanied by a small guard and Maester Torlin. The fields smelled of mold. The people didn't ask for aid, they were too proud. But their children looked at her like she was already a memory. She sat with them, barefoot in a barn, feeding soup to a boy named Cedric who had never seen a queen and didn't believe he was. When she left, she gave the farmers seed, silver, and her word. And Sansa Stark's word was not a promise, it was law. Back in Winterfell, tensions began to simmer between the houses of Glover and Manderley. A contested road dispute, insignificant under other rulers, had escalated into accusations of sabotage, theft, and even murder. Brandon met with both families in the council chamber. The lords shouted. He said nothing. Only when both ran out of words did Brandon Tallheart speak, calm and cold. Do either of you want to explain to your queen why your bruised pride matters more than her son's future? Silence. They signed peace by nightfall. Then came the ambush. Brandon was returning from an inspection of the Blackwood Pass when they struck. 4 cloaked riders, masked and fast. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply attacked. He took 1 arrow in the thigh before unseating 2 of them with brutal sweeps of his axe. The 3rd he crushed against a tree. The 4th fled. His guards found him bleeding beneath the trees, 1 leg shattered, his chest armor dented to hell. It was Jon Snow who carried him home on horseback. The great hall fell into a hush when the queen arrived at his bedside. Brandon's leg was mangled. He couldn't walk, could barely speak, but his eyes locked on hers like fire through a blizzard. "I'm not leaving you," Sansa whispered, brushing the damp hair from his brow. "You have to," he rasped. "No, I'm not dying, love," he said with a strained smile. "Just resting." For 3 moons, Sansa ruled alone. The people noticed. The small folk whispered of her return to silent walks and sleepless eyes. The bannermen stiffened their spines in her presence. Even the lords began to defer faster, speak softer, because she was everywhere, inspecting repairs in the Barrowlands and overseeing fever clinics in White Harbor, unattending road commissions in the Dreadfort, and holding night court for widows and bakers with no one else to speak for them. She did not break, but she did not smile. On the eve of the Midwinter Festival, a thick snow fell over the Godswood. The boys, Eddard and Rickon, woke to find the castle blanketed in white. Eddard asked, "Is Mother sad again?" Rickon answered for her, "No, she's winning." That night, Brandon called her to the bedchamber. He had not stood since the ambush. His crutches leaned against the wall untouched. "Come here," he said, voice low. Sansa sat on the edge of the bed. He reached for her hand. "I dreamt once," he whispered, "that I'd lose everything, that I'd end up broken like my father." She said nothing. "I was wrong," he said, "because I could lose my leg, my strength, my name, and I'd still be whole. Because I have you." Sansa leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "You are not your wounds." "No," he said, eyes soft, "and neither are you." In the spring thaw, Brandon walked again, limping, slower, but taller somehow, and Sansa, her grief buried beneath purpose, stood beside him with a smile that finally reached her eyes. The North had suffered again, but it had not bled in vain. Chapter 9. The Return of the Wolf. The raven came at dawn. Its wings black against a pale spring sky, it circled twice over Winterfell's towers before landing on the rampart outside Sansa's solar. It bore no seal, just a strip of leather tied around its leg, a single word burned into it. Home. That afternoon, Arya Stark returned to the north. She arrived with no banners, no entourage, just a weather-stained cloak, a long curved blade strapped across her back, and a look in her eyes that told of seas crossed, cities burned, and secrets kept. Sansa was in the courtyard when the gates opened. She did not run to meet her sister. She walked, slowly, reverently, like she was approaching a ghost. Arya smirked before the distance had closed. "Took you long enough," Sansa said. "You always did love the last word," Arya replied. They stood still for a moment, then embraced like only wolves could, fierce, silent, eternal. The people of Winterfell whispered stories of Arya's return. Some said she'd seen Valyria, others claimed she'd stolen a dragon egg. A few swore she hadn't aged a day, only grown sharper like a dagger honed with salt and blood. Sansa didn't ask. She didn't need to. That night the queen held a feast not of state but of family. The great hall was warmed by fresh-cut pine and meat pies baked with spiced apples. No dignitaries, no speeches, just old friends and kin, and Jon Snow, grayer now, laughing harder than he had in years. In Brienne, seated beside Davos, exchanging gruff smiles and battle tales. Then Tyrion, still sending ravens now and then, sent a wine cask labeled, "Drink at your own peril." Or mine. Even Gilly sent letters for the boys, each with a hand-stitched patch for their cloaks. Arya drank half the table under with northern mead, then disappeared and returned with a bow taller than she was, offering to shoot the apple off Rickon's head. Rickon, of course, volunteered immediately. Eddard was horrified. Sansa made Arya swear not to test her accuracy on royal children. Arya promised, fingers crossed behind her back. Later that evening, after the hall had emptied and the fires burned low, the sisters sat in the godswood. Beneath the weirwood tree, the red leaves shifted in a warm breeze. The moonlight cast long shadows between the roots. "You're not like them," Arya said softly. "Who?" "The queens in the stories. The ones who go mad, or die for love, or drown in silk." "No," Sansa agreed. "I outlived those stories." Arya tilted her head. "So, happy?" Sansa didn't answer right away. "I'm tired," she said at last, "but I'm whole. That's more than I expected." Arya nodded, brushing a red leaf from her lap. "I'll be gone again soon," she said. "You know that I don't belong in palaces." Sansa smiled. "You never did." Arya reached into her coat and pulled out a small dagger, curved, dark steel, etched in Braavosi runes. "For Eddard," she said. "When he's ready." Sansa took it gently, her fingers brushing Arya's. "He'll treasure it." "He better," Arya muttered. "It killed 2 men who really deserved it." The next morning, Arya was gone. No goodbyes, no note, just a single wolf sigil etched in frost on the stone by the eastern gate. But the rest of the north remained alive. Brandon, now walking more steadily, resumed his position at court with renewed strength. Rickon began sparring lessons under Sir Brienne and broke his wooden sword in the first hour, on someone else's ribs. Eddard was formally enrolled in the Maester's Northern Preparatory Academy, though he secretly kept his training dagger under his tunic. And Sansa walked Winterfell's walls again, her son's laughter echoing in the courtyards, her crown catching sunlight like a star. The queen had weathered war, fire, betrayal, and grief, but what remained was not ashes. It was joy, earned, enduring, real. Chapter 10. The North Remembers. The air in Winterfell tasted of wood smoke and pine. It was the 20th year of Sansa Stark's reign, and the North had never known such peace. The old maester said the trees grew taller now, that the fields near White Harbor yielded double what they had in the past, that the mines near Last Hearth hadn't run dry, but deeper, like the gods themselves were rewarding the land for remembering its roots. But those were the words of old men. The truth lay in the people. Children no longer shivered through their winters. Men and women worked not in desperation, but in craft. Blacksmiths forging blades for sport rather than war. Weavers spinning cloaks of artistry instead of survival. Even the direwolves had returned to the woods north of the wall. Farmers whispered sightings. No one hunted them. They were symbols now, not threats. Sansa stood atop the walls of Winterfell, gazing over the banners of the assembled houses. Serwyn, Glover, Umber, Tallheart, Manderley, Reed. Their keeps now gleamed with fresh stone, their halls warmed with fire and kin. Every house had sent a delegate to the Moot of Unity, the first such gathering in nearly 100 years. It was Brandon's idea, to formalize the North's new structure. A sovereign realm, yes, but one guided not by a single monarch's will alone. A council, chosen not by blood, but by merit. Elected, rotated, equal. Still, the Stark remained the heart, and always would. In the courtyard below, Eddard trained with Brienne's daughter, a fierce young warrior with her mother's stance and Podrick's charm. They clashed wooden blades and insults with equal skill. Rickon climbed the battlements like a squirrel, howling as he leapt from post to post with the reckless joy of a boy born into peace. Sansa watched them both with a quiet smile. They would lead one day. But not today. Today was for the people. That evening, a new festival was born, the Feast of the First Frost. Not a harvest festival, not a day of war remembrance, but a celebration of survival, of unity, legacy, and laughter. Bran sent his blessings from King's Landing. Jon, now Lord Commander again in all but name, sent a white cloak stitched with blue thread. For warmth and honor, he wrote. Even Arya returned, only for a night. She stood by the fire pit, flipping her dagger as children circled her, begging for stories. "You're the Queen's sister!" one girl squealed. "No," Arya said with a grin. "She's mine." In the final hours of the celebration, Sansa climbed the watchtower alone. Brandon joined her, his breath fogging in the cold air. Below, fireworks, a gift from the archmaesters of Old Town, lit the sky in bursts of violet and silver. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "Before all this?" Sansa considered. "I miss who I was," she said, "but I'd never trade who I became." Brandon took her hand. "The North will remember you." She nodded. "It already does." And in time they remembered her well, and as the Wolf Queen who ruled not by fear but with poise and patience, and as the woman who rebuilt the broken houses, who gave her people dignity, not just bread, as the last daughter of House Stark, and the first Queen of the North whose name became legend. The statues would come later, the stories would change, but the North never forgot Sansa Stark, because she had never forgotten it. In the North, the wind still howled, but it howled for her. Epilogue. 50 years had passed since her coronation. Winterfell stood unchanged and utterly different. The halls had been expanded, new towers added, glass greenhouses bloomed even in the coldest months. A school of ravens now operated from a dedicated rookery tower, sending letters across the realm faster than ever before. But in the heart of the keep, the old gods still watched. The weirwood tree in the godswood had grown broader, its face more worn by time and weather, and beneath it, on a quiet morning touched by snowflakes and silence, a woman sat alone. Sansa Stark, no longer queen, no longer regent, no longer anything but Sansa, watched the stillness of the world she helped create. Her hair had faded to ash blonde, but she wore it long, unbound. Her hands were thinner, her eyes were the same. Behind her, 2 boys played with a carved wooden direwolf. Grandsons. "Mother?" Eddard's voice, now the voice of a king. Not a crown wearer, he'd abolished those years ago, but a leader nonetheless. "We're ready," he said. "If you are..." Sansa stood slowly. "I am..." They walked together to the crypts, flanked by the royal family of the North, Rickon and his daughters. Arya's lone son, wild-eyed and sharp-tongued. Brienne's granddaughter, now Lady Commander of the Northern Watch. Samwell Tarly's descendants stood alongside Tyrion's niece, a poet from Lannisport. They were not one house, they were a people. The ceremony was simple. No gold, no songs. Just a carved stone laid in the crypt beside Lyanna, Catelyn, Ned. Her plaque read, "Sansa Stark, the queen who remembered, born of ash, crowned in snow, beloved of the North." That night, snow fell heavier than it had in a decade. Some said it was a storm. Others said it was her last gift, blanketing the kingdom in the silence she loved best. Years later, travelers from the south would arrive at Winterfell and speak in hushed tones about the statue of the red-haired woman in the godswood, seated rather than standing, hands open in her lap, as if still listening. They said wolves howled at its feet, and that every child who laid a hand on her stone knee dreamed of snow and stars and a voice whispering, "You are not alone, you are of the North." And the North remembers. And far beyond the wall, where no map dares mark, the wind carried her name, Sansa, Queen of the North. Author's note. When I first imagined this story, I didn't want to rewrite Westeros. I wanted to finish what it started. Sansa Stark was never the loudest voice. She didn't conquer cities. She didn't slay dragons. But she survived them, all of them. And then she built something better. Queen of the North is my love letter to the quiet rulers, the hard choices, and the strength that doesn't always shout. It's about family, loyalty, and what it means to rise without burning everything down. To everyone who joined me for this 10-chapter journey, thank you. Whether you cried during the coronation, smiled at Arya's return, or held your breath through Brandon's ambush, I hope this story gave you something you didn't expect. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more epic spin-offs like this one. And if you've made it this far, well, the North remembers. Brian M. Brumbaugh.